All right, Lachanda, here we are live on the Trauma Informed Educators Network podcast, episode number 48, which I have to tell you blows my mind that there's almost been 50 episodes. But what a better 48th episode than to talk to you. Our paths just crossed, and I'm like, I need to talk to you on my podcast. So how are you? And welcome to the podcast.
Oh my gosh, I am doing very, very well. A lot going on, closing out the end of the school year, getting ready to travel back to the States. So there's just a lot going on right now. And I'm just so excited and delighted, one, that we've been connected in this very interesting way. And so excited to get this chance to talk to you and to share and to just have this conversation. I get an hour of your time. I'm excited about that.
Oh, no, I get an hour of your time. See, that's how it works. I just do this for fun so I can learn from really amazing people like yourself. So let's start off like I start off every podcast. Tell us the Lachanda Garrison story. Tell us about you.
Gosh, okay. It's like interesting because it's like, which way do you go? I'm learning that we're made up of so many different stories. And, those are kind of like the culmination of who is showing up in front of you today, right? So a big part of my story is growing up as a military connected child. And that experience, my dad is a retired Marine. My mom is from the Philippines, and just growing up in that space was very interesting for me, and living overseas and attending a variety of schools. So a lot of my story, honestly, is this military life. And then now working and teaching military connected children. So it's like paying that back of my experiences growing up and being a military child. That's a short version.
Yeah, and that brings you a perspective, right? And the work around healing center education, trauma informed education, resilient based education, whatever we want to call it, what we know is that our experiences as human beings build the ability to us to empathize, and this is what Dr. Bruce Perry talked about on the last podcast, to be able to empathize and connect with other people, right? It builds empathy. And so what I hear you saying is your experiences has prepared you for the job that you're in because you've been through it.
Totally. It just totally does. And what's also so interesting is that my husband, who's also an educator, he joined the military also. And so not only was I a military child, a military spouse, and a mother to military connected children. So it's like this cycle that keeps continuing. And I'm just learning so much. Like, as I was thinking about this podcast and some of the work that I'm doing, it's just interesting because it's like the more I go through this, the more I realize I don't know. And I've walked through this. So it's just learning so much more about myself and my experiences and making those connections and tying those connections to my children and the students I teach. It's like, oh my gosh, I still have so much to learn just about this little niche space.
And not only are you a teacher with the Department of Defense, you are the teacher of the year for the department. That is huge. And that has to make you feel validated, right? And although sometimes in these positions, not only you're validated, but you got to say, hey, what I'm saying doesn't necessarily represent the organization in which I serve. But at the end of the day, you are the teacher of the year for the department. How did you see that come about? Did you know it was coming about? How did you land in that space?
So it's very interesting. And like you mentioned earlier, like these opinions and these experiences are my own. I'm so blessed and fortunate to be able to represent the teachers in this space, but to be a state teacher of the year has been an incredible experience. A lot of it was, I believe I had something to say, and what are the avenues in which I can have my voice heard in order to advocate for students and teachers, just in general. And it's just hard because it's like the climate of what's happening in the United States right now, and just being a person of color, being a woman, being an educator, all of that coming together and saying, I believe that I have something important to share. So with that belief, we're also people who stepped in and said, I believe in you. And I believe in what you're doing. I believe that your voice needs to be heard. So then it's like, someone nominates you and you want to honor that they took the time to say, like, I want to hear her voice. What she has to say is important regarding students and teachers. So I have actually been nominated a number of times, and I kept applying because I did believe that there was something that needed to be shared. And this was possibly the space and the platform I could use to share it. So honestly, that's how I entered this space. Just that belief that if I can advocate for the students and the teachers and for the profession, then sign me up. I'm ready and willing, to serve.
So when you talk about a military connected children, because I actually am the son of a retired military. My father's retired military, and he wasn't in the military very long because he was wounded. But as a child growing up with someone in the military who has and still struggles with severe PTSD, there's a lot of aspects of growing up in a military family that I think many people do not understand. So when you say military connected children, what does that mean? I mean, what does that mean? Because, and I want you to know, Lachanda, too, that I actually had somebody reach out in the Trauma Informed Educators Network wanting to talk about this subject like a week before I even said you were going to be on here. So I know there's people that want to know more about this experience. But what does it mean to be a military connected child?
I would say to be a military connected child, it's any child who has a parent. I would even extend it to family members who serve in the U.S. Armed Forces, along with the National Guard and as a reservist. And I would say that all of that makes that child military connected. Now, that can make the space very big if we're talking about extended family. But when you do have, like, let's say, not only a parent, but maybe an aunt, uncle who are serving, and maybe they're separated from the family, if that family's close, it does make an impact on that child. So I would say for some families, extended family members who are in that space, serving actively or in the National Guard or as a reservist, that child who is tied to that service member is a military connected child. You're muted, Matthew.
Oh my goodness, failure.
I know. You think that we would get so good at this. It happens to us all the time.
Listen, 2021 it's not over yet. Like,
It's not.
the school year's out for me, but the year's not over because I just muted myself on my podcast. Like, Lachanda, thank you for your forgiveness, because man, that's a first right there.
No, that's just grace. We just have to show each other.
You got me so excited. Like, I was just wanting to like ask you more questions, and I got caught up. Nonetheless, but why trauma informed education? Why did that spark your interest? Where did your interest spark, and how did you come about wanting to start this journey that so many of us have started or are starting? How did you get to trauma informed education in your experience as an educator with the Department of Defense?
So I'm going to go back. Maybe I'm trying to think when my husband went to school. I think maybe it was 2007. And when you get promoted at certain ranks, you go to certain schools. And we were able to leave our teaching position for a year. He left for a year, I left for a semester. And it was really interesting because we went to an Army base, and they had all of these opportunities for spouses and children at that time. And at that season, it was either you were coming off a deployment or you're about to head into a deployment. So they tried to make like this experience like the best year you were going to have with your family. So they offered all of these services. And one of the classes that I took was on resilience. And I remember thinking, oh my goodness, this is what we are missing. We are missing this. And it came from like a spouse and family point of view. But in my mind, I saw it from an educator's stance. And so that was really a big hot topic in conversation that they were sharing with spouses at that time. I remember I had a binder, took this class. It just opened my eyes to this whole way of interacting with people that I had never heard of before. And then I was also wondering, as a military spouse, like where has this been? So my husband was working on his doctorate at the time. And I said, I have an idea for your dissertation. And I said, I think it needs to be about resilience and military connected children. So that happened. And he ended up writing his dissertation on that. And then, gosh, when did it come out? Maybe 3 years ago, Oprah Winfrey, when she stopped her show, she did this 60-minute special. And it was about trauma. So I had the resilience information, but I didn't really know much about the trauma portion. And I'm thinking, oh my word, she was showcasing like this school that was trauma informed. And I'm like, where can I get certified in this? Where can I learn more about this? Like, I need this training so that I can better support my students. And I couldn't find anything at the time. And I was a math coach at the time. And then 2 years ago, we moved from Spain to Bahrain. That's where we're at now. And I went back into the classroom. And I would have liked to have said that my classroom management was on point. You know, I had this down, maybe a little extra confident. And I had these amazing students who changed my life. And one in particular really stands out. And honestly, if it wasn't for this child, I would not be before you today talking about being trauma informed and resilience focused. It was so challenging. I had never experienced anything like it before. And he was one out of multiple children who struggled. And I just didn't know what to do. So I chose to allow this child to change my life. And, you know, I kind of met my match. And I remember we would talk about certain things in class. And so I'm teaching second grade. The 2 years prior to that, he had been used to just running out of class, that fight or flight. And if he would get frustrated, he might hit a child. He might get really angry. He had some of these compulsive things that he would also do too. And I did not have the tools to help him learn and help him regulate his body. And I remember calling the counselor all the time, calling the principal all the time, and just really thinking like, what in the world is going on? Like, I thought that I had the skills needed to help all students learn, and I didn't. It was so humbling. And I remember a mentor teacher coming in, looking at another child and said, you know, what system that you're using now isn't working for you. And so I had to really reflect on these practices that I was using. They weren't trauma informed. I didn't know that then. And then really reflecting on what do I need to change. And this is when I came to this conclusion. If it wasn't working, then I needed to get rid of all of it. If something was not working for these children, I had to be willing to make myself uncomfortable and get rid of it. But here's the awkward thing. It's why was I holding on to practices that weren't effective, but I was scared to try something that could have been effective. And that's what kind of like boggles my mind even to this day. Like, it wasn't working for my students, but I wasn't willing to let it go until another mentor teacher who I had a relationship with said, is this really working for you?
I think that's like a Dr. Phil line too, isn't it?
I think it is.
But at the end of the day, right? And there's a quote, and when you started talking, it really resonated with me. If you change the way you look at things, the things you look at change, right? And so when you look at a child who is struggling, if you look at that as a struggle, or you look at it as a symptom of something greater, then it changes the way you look at it. And I think what I've learned in education is educators take it personal when kids are struggling.
Yes.
And what I heard you say was like, wait, what I did didn't work, but why was I holding on to it? Well, that's because that's how our systems are built, right? You're told this is what you do in these situations, and then it's supposed to work. But what we know now is that it doesn't work for all kids. And unfortunately, sometimes we think that kids aren't, that all kids aren't worthy of our expectations, that if they don't meet them. So it's like, we don't have time for them. Wow, how powerful. And so you listen to that 60 Minutes with Oprah and you were like, hold on a minute. Like, tell me about that experience, because I watched that too. And I was already on this journey, but it just fired me up even more.
When she said a couple of things, I'm probably going to butcher it. One of the things that she said was that we can't tell children to just like pull up their bootstraps. They might need an adult in their life who can help them put those boots on. It was something along those lines. And I was like, whoa.
Like military, you're talking like literally boots. Like,
yes,
you're literally talking boots. Yeah, wow.
Literally. And then she basically said a child only needs one person to change their life, one person to really see their humanity, see who they were, see who they are. And I'm like, okay, if I have a classroom of students, and if I can learn more about this, like hopefully I can impact and be a part of the solution for these individual students in my classroom. The hard thing at that time, I couldn't find any training. I think I went on, when I went back into the classroom in particular, right away, I saw, I got a little, you're right, I shouldn't look at the thing because I saw it popped up and I got distracted. Okay. But whenever I went looking for it, I couldn't find any training. So that was my struggle, was I couldn't find something. And people were saying, oh, you know, people reached out on Twitter. I've learned so much on Twitter. I have become grown as an educator because of Twitter. And I remember people pointing me to like slides. You can read these slides on it. You can read this paper on it, but I wanted training and I couldn't find anything at the time. So it's like, I had to wait for things to kind of catch up. And honestly, it was the pandemic when I started seeing training on it and jumped on it, because even with that student in particular, at the beginning of the year, I was looking, because I remembered Oprah and I said, okay, I think there might be trauma here. Where can I get training for this child? And I remember looking at that Twitter tweet, even like recently, it was like in November, I was looking and couldn't find anything. So that was the hard part. It's like, I made the connection between what I saw on Oprah and made the connection to my students who were struggling, and realized I needed something. But I couldn't find it.
Well, and I've got to tell you, thank you, because that's what we have to be, in a space of reflection. And I think that so many times we want kids to fit in the box that works for the adult. And that isn't always the case. Matter of fact, it's never the case. That kids do, in the words of Dr. Ross Green, who was on this podcast, kids do well if they can. And I think if you live on that idea that the kids do well if they can, then you don't have to take things personally. And I think that's such a learned lesson that I've had to, as a school leader and as an educator. Like, when kids are struggling and they're expressing themselves through what people refer to as behavior, because they're outside of their circle of capacity, then I have to figure out what's going to work. So let's get into some of the pieces of being in a military connected family that you feel is so important to look at through a trauma-informed lens. For example, transitions, because that's huge in families.
Yes. So there was some data that came out. There was a survey that came out through the Military Child Education Coalition. I think it came out in 2020. And some of the information that came out with that was like there are over 2 million military connected children in classrooms within the United States. So my passion with this is educators may not realize that they have military connected children in their classroom
Mm-hmm.
and things that they could be going through. So I want to really share an awareness for that, because although I may work in this space that's dedicated towards military connected children, we have military connected children across the United States.
Mm-hmm.
So with that said, there are certain things that make that group of children unique, but the amazing thing is that being trauma informed is something that can be used for all children. It's good for all children. If it's used equitably, it can totally help all students cope and regulate and ultimately heal, and be a healing process within that parallel process of the educator and the student. Some of the things that are a part of that family dynamics are transitions and the frequent moves. When I was growing up as a military connected child, I counted recently 6 different elementary schools.
Wow.
Like 6 elementary schools. I remember moving. My dad was stationed in California at Camp Pendleton. And I remember going, maybe it was first grade. And I was at a school for a long time, because sometimes those transitions take a long time. Children might be out of school for a while.
Mm-hmm.
And then we get to this new school, moved to Virginia, and I remember not talking. I couldn't talk. And just reflecting on that now as a child, like I felt so uncomfortable to the point that I couldn't even speak. I remember being in PE
Wow.
class and just standing there. And then I remember, like, I don't know how many weeks later, I said something or I moved or I did the activity and everyone was so excited because I just didn't. They would do these movements and things and I would just stand there. And that was part of that transition. That was part of that moving, and moving like that can be very challenging for students. Just going to school in general can be a little traumatizing.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's true.
Yes, but moving so often, and deployments. And I remember my dad being gone. He went to Japan whenever I was younger, and that was a struggle. You know, my mom is from a different country, and she's raising these 2 young children and is not from America. And English is not her first language. So I can't even imagine what she was going through, you know, living in America, raising these 2 children, and your husband is gone. And that's who you speak with. That's who you partner with. And this is in the 80s. So we didn't have internet. We didn't have Wi-Fi.
Yeah, you know, she wasn't going onto a Facebook group for military families and getting advice. Right.
Yes. So just knowing like these certain things impact military connected children in these different ways, and just having a trauma informed mindset of recognizing what could this child be experiencing? What's happening with this child? That child may not be able to pinpoint specifically, because I was young. I probably couldn't tell you. It's taken a lot of reflection to say, you know, I bet you it was that move that I became a selective mute, you know?
Right, sure. Which is a trauma response, honestly.
Yes.
I mean, it really is. And that comes down to that freeze response. And that's your way of, that was your way of building safety for yourself. And I mean, I'm going to be honest. I've seen this in my school of kids who came in brand new that literally would not. And we have a young lady right now who it's taken her 2 years. And I mean, it really is when you think about it. I don't think people think about that when they think about military families necessarily, of that trickle down impact all the way to young children that you're speaking of and that you work with every day.
Yes, I even remember that in one of my elementary schools. We had a student who was selective mute. You would see the child at home talking and having fun, and you're like, wow. And then at school, and I'm like, okay, I remember that. In first grade, this child was a first grader too.
Wow.
And so, lots of transitions, lots of moving around. I think even now, reflecting as a child and thinking about my own children and working with military connected students, that moving is huge, especially when you don't understand why, and you can't communicate it, especially when you're so young. And then as you get older, because I moved again when I was in like a middle school. I mean, I had those 6 elementary schools and then middle school, and then moving to Japan and doing middle school and high school there. I don't think you even still have the language then, unless someone is really engaging you and in a safe way talking to you about what's happening, and the partnership between parents and teachers, that wasn't really happening at the time either. So having this trauma informed mindset and recognizing that everyone within the organization and within the system needs to be trained, down to the counselor, down to the bus driver, down to the lunch monitor, down to working with parents and helping them become aware, because I don't think my parents knew. And then there was a gap between my parents and the teachers and the school system. And I don't see that that's a lot different today. I think we've gotten better and we have social media and we can say that's connecting, but are we genuinely forming relationships and bonds and seeing the families in our communities? I think some schools do it well. I think some schools don't do it as well. But how can we make this approach, as Alex says in her new book, a universal approach, so that we are connecting with the families, we are connecting with commands, we are like everyone is connected in this system because they are attached to that child.
I mean, I just think too that there's so many correlations to different communities. And what you're describing is very similar to what I see sometimes even at the school that I lead, where it's not necessarily deployment or changing, but it is a lot of moving and it is a lot of starting new schools. And I think there is this misnomer, and I think Bruce Perry in Oprah's book, What Happened to You, that we talked about last week with Dr. Perry, really pushes home the misnomer that kids are they're just young, they don't get it, or they don't understand, it doesn't bother them because they're so resilient, or that idea of, well, they're just going to pull themselves up by them bootstraps and be gritty, right? That G word, it gives me like cold chills, right? But it's not about grit. It's about trying to navigate these changes that even in the adult world are hard to manage, let alone not having the vocabulary and the life experiences. And let's be honest, the neuro and brain development to be able to process it. So I'm going to tell you, Lachanda, if they're not doing, and by them, I mean all military-based schools, are not doing a morning meeting connection with every kid and just where are they in the moment and what an open share time, it's a missed opportunity that can be done right now. Because kids have to know that other kids are feeling how you're feeling. Because if not, you feel like you're the only one feeling that way.
Because we don't create those spaces, right? So I'm just hoping, and we have so many wonderful educators, and I know that we're all trying our best. We are working so hard, and then we're in this pandemic, and I just feel that educators are so open. What can I do? And like you said, having a morning meeting, like it doesn't take much. It does not take much. One of the things I started doing with students is we ended up creating this like a calm book and just doing 15 minutes or less. And that might seem a lot to some teachers. You can tweak it, of just, sometimes it was draw your safe place. Where is it? Let's share it. Let's go there. Let's visit it. If you wanted to feel safe, what would you put in your backpack? What makes you feel good? And these are second graders. Like we can build these little bits of time for them to just kind of decompress and get in touch with their body so that they can stay embodied, so that they can sit and settle and ground. Like you said, that morning meeting doesn't take much. Having that time to create that calm book doesn't take much. It's just being intentional. And that's where that universal approach kind of comes in. Like this, we can use it class-wide. We may have I'm just making up a number. Maybe we have half the students who are suffering from some sort of trauma at this moment. But you know what? This can help all students thrive. And I think that you're right. It doesn't have to be something crazy and out there. There are little things we can do.
I wonder, and you can be like, no, you're completely off base, because I don't know. And like I said, I grew up in a home with a father who had severe PTSD from military combat, but I didn't grow up in a military family. I did go to a military hospital my whole life. So it was really weird when I walked in and people had white coats. I'm like, why aren't you wearing your fatigues? Nonetheless. But I wonder, because the way our amazing military personnel are trained and go through boot camp, whatever various military branch they're in, they are trained to suppress sometimes emotions and feelings because they have to for survival, right?
Mm-hmm.
If they're in a military space. And I know my dad was trained that way. And I know my father-in-law actually retired as a sergeant major from the military, from Army, 30 years of service. So there is a training of that. Do you see that having an impact on the way that there's an interaction with children? Like, is there a different mindset, or do you see that transfer in? And by all means, I know this is a wide net that I'm casting that almost seems like we're stereotyping, but I don't want that to be the case. I want to say, like, do you see some of those things transitioning into homes and classrooms of children who are military connected?
I would say, of course, but it also depends on how that parent was raised.
Right.
Too. That makes an impact on what you receive when you go to boot camp. So it could be almost like anyone who enters your classroom.
Sure.
Depending on their experiences and how they were raised, do those types of trainings affect you in a certain way?
Mm-hmm.
And I would say for sure, like it does influence, and it can influence something positively or negatively.
Right.
And I would say from my own experience, growing up as a military child, for me, I was not taught about my emotions. I was not taught how to even really acknowledge them. It was just, no one really paid attention to me in that way. And it's not a dig on my parents. It's
no,
just
not at all.
They knew. So then I have children. And now that I reflect, oh my gosh, if I sit and think about like, whoa, I could have done better with teaching them how to be more aware of their emotions, that it got passed down. And now, did it get passed down because of the military training and background? Maybe it added to it. Maybe it exacerbated it, but I didn't have those skills. So I think if you don't have them because they weren't passed down to you, that training could add to it, or it could in a good way or in a bad way. I think it just depends. But when you think about my husband and I think as we reflect and look back now, because our children are older, our children are adults, and now we're having these conversations with them. And being a military family, there were certain things where we were like, you have to step up, you have to you have to suck it up. We did those things. Mm-hmm. But was it because of my husband's military training? I don't know. I think it's more based off of how we grew up.
Yeah. And I think that's powerful. I mean, and I think that perspective is really important for people who are working with military connected families, that it's powerful to know that sometimes your life experience is what you carry as opposed to the training you may have received. And I think that's huge. Like, I mean, and I think that's for anybody, the way we parent, the way we were parented, we tend to parent, unless our paradigm shifts and we know how to do it better. And let's be honest, I'm by far no parent. I'm not a perfect parent at all. And there's even times I'm like, I cannot believe I just yelled at my child. When I talk about the impacts of yelling at children, I'm like, why did I do that? Oh, I got to go apologize. Oh man, here we go. Like, I mean, that's just the nature of being a human and making mistakes. But let's get into the impact of attachment in the realm in which you work, especially with families. How do you see attachment playing a role? Because I mean, I can only imagine, I didn't experience it myself, how challenging it must be when deployment occurs and the parent comes back and then they're deployed again. I can only imagine with it. But what do you see the role of attachment in military connected families?
Wow. I mean, and the cool thing, not the cool thing, but the interesting thing about the attachment, it's in so many different levels, and it depends on the age of the child. Recently, I've been interviewing like educators, military connected educators, and family members and students and stuff. And in particular, I interviewed a military connected educator who teaches high school. And at that time, you're so social, right? And making friends is very important. But when you move, it can be very hard. So you either see sometimes children who attach quickly, like, I need to make a friend. I need to make a friend right away. This person said hi to me. I'm going to be their friend. And it could potentially be a healthy relationship or an unhealthy, but because you moved and you feel isolated or you might feel alone, you might just latch on to the first person who might be nice to you that day. Versus I've dealt with students, like my own children in particular, my son struggled. He would not, like when we moved to Kansas, he would not step out. He wouldn't even want to knock on anyone's door to ask where the bus stop was. So then you have this whole other side where I'm not going to attach at all. And then you see it with families. I remember watching my stepmom and how she would make connections when we moved overseas to Japan. And I remember my mother-in-law, because my mother-in-law is a retired DoDIA educator. And she was like, friendships are quick and fast, quick and fast, because time is short. You
Wow.
don't know if this person is going to be here 1 year, 2 years, 3 years. So you jump in, all in quickly. And
Wow.
you see that with parents, you see that with children, you see that because you want to connect, you want to belong, you might be away from family and friends, and you're in these interesting dynamics, and you could be moving to a town where everyone grew up with each other.
Mm.
Oh, I remember like being in elementary school and everyone was everyone's cousin. And I'm like, I don't have any cousins here.
Yeah.
I better not run my mouth too much, because if I get in a fight, no one's going to have my back,
Wow.
or you could move overseas and everyone's in this awkward space, but
Right.
everyone's also trying to reinvent themselves and be something different. So the attachment thing is so interesting because at different levels, it can mean different things. So it's just interesting.
Well, and then you bring in this whole third culture, being a third culture child, right? Like, and I think that there's a lot of people that can relate to this, whether it's immigrants that have come to the United States, because that I actually taught non-English speaking kids. So I got to experience being an educator of children caught between multiple cultures, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's a challenge because, and I worked in middle and high schools, never forget, we had a group of Somalian girls who were just hilarious, but they would put makeup on the bus on the way to school. And then they would have to take it off before they got home because they were trying, like they were stuck in this cultural push and pull. And it's a challenging space for a lot of kids. And what you're talking about, whether it's within the States or whether it's internationally, it still sounds like there's this sense of being stuck in between multiple layers of culture.
Oh gosh. I remember, okay, so, my mom's from the Philippines, and I remember living in Arizona and walking off the bus, and I could smell food from my bus stop. And I remember thinking, oh my goodness, that's my mom. And she had like cooked some octopus.
I thought you were going to say, that smells good, because that's what I would be saying if I got off the bus and could smell my mom's cooking.
It was
But
like,
I get it. Yeah.
Yeah. Why
yeah.
is she cooking this? And then you're like embarrassed.
Oh,
Because you're
yeah.
like,
Oh, yeah.
oh my gosh. And no one else's mom is cooking octopus.
Right.
And you can smell it down the street. So like you said, like we're living in the States and I'm having these different cultural dynamics. Like I talk about my mom doing arts and crafts with me. And one of her arts and crafts that she would do was she would boil eggs and she would crush these eggshells. And then we would draw a picture on a piece of paper. We would put glue and sprinkle the different eggshells, like different colored eggshells on it. Like that was my arts and crafts growing up.
Yeah.
So it was interesting whenever I would go to different families' homes, and it was so different than my own. And that was just being in the States, let alone whenever I grew up overseas. So imagine you have these children who are growing up with parents from different cultures and backgrounds, because a lot of times you have service members who get stationed overseas or deployed overseas and they meet their spouses from a variety of countries. And then they come back to the States, they have different cultures. So you have a child who has this mixture of culture, but sometimes it doesn't fit in. And it doesn't fit, it doesn't mesh well. So like the girls from Somalia, you're wanting to fit in, you're wanting to wear the makeup like everyone else, but that's not really something that you do at home. So it can be very challenging, and because you don't feel like you belong. And I think as human beings, we want to belong. And so with military connected children in particular, having spaces of belonging and having opportunities to share your culture is huge. And that's part of my big platform, especially as a state teacher of the year, is really creating spaces of learning that are intentional, that weave in my students' culture, because they need to be seen, but also I want the other students in my classroom to see how beautiful these different cultures are, and that not one is better than the other, but that we can appreciate them. We can learn from them. We can humanize each other. And that starts young. You can see young kids othering other children who are different.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
You see it on the playground. You see it like, so we have to be intentional with creating these spaces where all children, not just military connected children, have an opportunity to share their experiences and how they've navigated the world.
Well, and at the end of the day, we're all looking for connection, whether you're 440 or 440. I mean, it is. And I think validation is such an important piece. And I'm going to be honest, Lachanda, I haven't heard many people talking about what you're talking about in this work. And you're right. There's a military base 45 minutes north of Nashville. It's in Kentucky. And Clarksville is the I've never had a conversation around this. And I'm like, this needs to be a huge conversation that not only the Department of Defense Education, but the surrounding school districts that are around military bases, these conversations need to be happening, because on so many levels, our military men and women are already giving up a lot. But a lot of times what you don't hear about is how much the families are giving up or the families are experiencing. And I think that we have to look at that through line of the sacrifices that are being made all the way down to kids, right? Mm-hmm. But I know that kids, right, all kids, if having strong, stable, nurturing, supportive relationships, whether that's the mom, the parent, the dad that's at home, or a teacher that is at the school, can use their experience as a military connected child, right, to be prepared for life in a resilient way. What are some of the experiences that you've had that you're like, wow, kids have just shown when there's the right measure of connection that they can just really shine in a space of being, and I know that cis white on here, like, she's like, I wish I could quit saying resilient because I don't want kids to be resilient. I want to be kids to be supported. But in this, it's really a necessity of our country, right? That we have people that are willing to do that. So what are some of those experiences?
Gosh, I think it boils down to, as an educator and as a teacher, the lessons that we teach and we create for our students. And so, one, recognizing what our students are going through. And one of the stories I'm going to share is a little extreme, but I think it was a year and a half ago, we were having a conflict here in the Middle East, not here in Bahrain, but in the Middle East. And I remember a mom coming in and she needed support. And, dad just left. There's lots of drama and tension in the area. And the success was, sometimes it's not just about the academics. It's when you can sit down with that parent and love on them and say, I am here for you. When you understand and you know what that child is going through, and then you can create lessons where they see themselves and they can feel empowered. Those are the successes. It's when you are culturally responsive and you are using storytelling. I'm really big on storytelling. Okay, so a part of my big platform is being culturally responsive through storytelling under this lens of being trauma-informed and resilience-focused. And even greater, being under this lens of teaching so my students have an equitable and just education. So creating spaces where my students' stories are heard, shared, valued is very powerful for me. So I use this a lot in mathematics. And so what I've learned is, if you can weave in these experiences that your students have, in spite of conflict that's happening, whether it's in the region or in the home, and being cognizant of that, they can still thrive. They can still learn because you're embedding them within that educational setting, and they see themselves. And they don't even have to see themselves personally. Seeing their classmates is enough, because when you teach through stories, those mirror neurons start going off, and it's as if you're living that experience yourself. So how can we be intentional with incorporating our students' cultures, identities, no matter what's happening around us, no matter what's happening in the home, so that they can feel valued, so they can thrive and they can learn. So when my students are like, my students who might be ESL, I had an ESL student and his mom was African. His dad was actually half Black and half Filipino like me. And he's asking me, Miss Garrison, when are we going to learn more word problems? You don't hear students asking for that. You don't hear students who, when you're having a crisis all around you, asking for word problems, but it's because they saw themselves in it. So those are the successes that I would say I have experienced teaching my military connected students, is being acutely aware and having relationships with the families and being intentional with creating learning experiences where my students see that what they go through and what they experience is important, and to humanize one another and to advocate for their learning. So that's just a little part of the work that I've been doing as a trauma-informed educator.
And Lachanda, you could replace military connected families with anything. What you just said applies to anything.
Yes.
And I think whether it's racial differences, whether it's socioeconomic differences, whether it's geographical differences, right? I mean, anything is about making a connection to a child on what you're teaching. And I love that through storytelling, because at the end of the day, it isn't about my experiences as a teacher and when I was in school and when I grew up. It has nothing to do with that. Although I do think kids love hearing stories about when we were kids.
They do.
But more importantly, they love seeing themselves in what is happening and what we're trying to do when it comes to instructional design. And I think that there's a lot of work being done in that space, but I don't think the work is being done in the space that you're doing the work in. And I think there can always be more work. So
Oh,
this,
so
I told you
true.
this was going to go fast.
I
So
know. I'm like,
it goes, I
too much
know
to talk about.
we could just talk about a whole nother thing for another 50 minutes, but
I
instead
know.
I'm going to ask you one more question. It's the question that I ask everybody at the end of the podcast. And that is, what do you, Lachanda Garrison, the state teacher of the year for the Department of Defense, what do you want educators to know about right now in this work?
Gosh, with this work with being trauma informed, I think, there's so many places. What do I want people to know right now? I want people to know that this work isn't just a label. We have so many buzzwords in education right now, and we can spew off all of these things. I'm trauma informed, I'm resilience focused, I'm culturally responsive, I use storytelling and identity. Those are all part of my platforms. But here's what happens. If you're not sharing what it is that you're actually doing and just labeling yourself as these things, I believe that it removes accountability for the work. And it could potentially cause harm. And it could cause harm unintentionally.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we need to really reflect on, what do these terms mean to us,
Mm-hmm.
and how do they impact the students? And then asking ourselves, what are we actually doing about this?
Mm-hmm.
And the reason why I say this is because, I've seen some like videos, you see these teachers who are being like, whatever it is, like anti-racist or whatever,
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
they're using these practices and just labeling themselves, but it's like dangerous.
Mm-hmm.
So I really want us to really create a space where we can share, okay, I believe in this, but this is what I'm doing about this.
Yeah.
This is how this looks for me. And you know what? I don't know all this stuff. So I'm learning. Can you please share with me on how I can grow in this space?
Mm-hmm.
Which is why I'm so grateful to you and all the work that's being done in this trauma-informed space, because I have books sitting here beside me right now. And I've heard you say this before, we will never arrive.
Mm-mm.
We will never arrive, but just labeling ourselves is the danger. And when we do that, also, it doesn't mean it's equitable. And it's being trauma informed, using social emotional learning can be dangerous.
Mm-hmm.
So unless we really know and understand, and we're seeking and we're wanting to grow, we have to be careful, because then we just take on a label. We can cause harm unintentionally, and that's not what we want to do. As educators, we have signed up to not cause further harm. So I think that's what I would want people to, other educators, to, like, what I would like to leave them with. Just talk about what you're doing.
Yeah.
Talk about the what and who it's impacting and why.
And I 100% agree, because a lot of people want to talk about why to do it. Why do we need to do it? And I think, when the school that I lead was featured on Edutopia, that was out of the blue. We had no idea. We were doing the what, and we didn't even know what we were doing. We just knew we needed to do something different.
Yes.
And what we did then isn't even what we do now. And I tell people, when that Edutopia video came out, and it's been viewed by over 7 million people, that I would love for them to do another one that says, well, that's what we did, but now this is what we do. And in like 3 years, be like, oh yeah, we don't do that anymore either. We do this, because it's evolving, and it's constantly, it's these hard conversations, and it's this reflection of going, is this equitable? Is what we're doing right? And I tell people all the time, people have me come in to speak, and really all I say is, quit being a jerk to kids. Like, literally just love kids, like genuinely care about their well-being.
Let's start right there.
That's it. Like, I should just walk in sometimes and go, okay, this is my message. Stop being jerks to kids.
Yes.
And just walk off. Or say, and this is what I tell adults in my building. If you want me to do it to you, don't do it to a child. Because at the end of the day, kids feel everything that we feel. Mm-hmm. They just may not be able to identify what it is they feel, or have the capacity, skills, or even neural processing to know what to do when they feel. it's not, we make it more complicated than it is. Let's be honest.
We do.
It just comes down to understand the impact that what we now label behavior. What does that really mean? And quit trying to put a punishment on the behavior and start figuring out what is actually happening or what has happened to the kid. Right? It's not, I say it's all the time, it's not rocket surgery, right? You just got to really care about kids and build that space of capacity of going, you're struggling. What's going on? Tell me what's happening. Sometimes that's it. That's it.
Curiosity. Like, I'm curious about you, genuinely.
Really? Right. Yeah.
I'm genuinely curious. I'm willing to actively care for you. What does that look like? And I think we just say things and then we're like, okay, I'm off the hook. That's it. I did my thing. I did my culturally responsive thing. And hey, I got this.
I went to my 2-hour trauma-informed training and now, no, listen, I'm going to be honest. And I'll tell you, I have this podcast. There's all kinds of stuff. There are times that I make bad mistakes with kids, families, and educators. There are.
Yes.
And I said this 1,000 times. There's no most trauma-informed educator. We're all on a journey. We're all on a path. We're all on an experience of how do we disrupt, right? How do we disrupt these archaic systems that put adults a lot of times ahead of kids? I say this too, that schools weren't built so adults could have jobs. And I do, and I will tell you, I support the adults in my building as much as I support the kids. But we've got to get this vision back to, well, what about the child? How does that impact them on a daily basis?
Yeah,
anyway,
there was something that you shared with me, when we have talked before, like, I think it's not pretty. This work we're doing
it's
is not
messy.
Pretty. Yes, and it's not cute. It's messy.
Yes.
And when you said that, I'm like, that just hit the nail on the head, because I think sometimes we want to give ourselves a label and then we want to package it so it's cute. That's not the work.
No.
The work is messy. The work was meeting with that one student and his parents every single week.
That's it.
The work was dad crying because dad loved this child so much and just didn't know what else to do.
Right.
Like, this is the work. This is the work when you have parents coming in because parents are gone and dad has left, and being there. That's the work. It's not cute. It's not pretty. We can't package it in a bow and then say, okay, SEL, we got it.
That's it. And it's interesting because, and I know we were going to conclude like 5 minutes ago, but I do want to keep talking for just a second. But I think that even when we interview candidates for the school, I have a candidate letter. I explain all of our philosophies. I have our core beliefs that we redesigned last year. I send them to the candidate and I said, let this frame your thinking as we meet. And a lot of educators, and especially new educators, I'm so drawn by trauma-informed work, and it's just work worth doing. And I just say, it's really hard and messy. Like, there's nothing easy about not suspending a kid when they make a mistake. There's nothing, matter of fact, it's harder on us, and it should be, because this isn't about changing a child's behavior. It's about getting to the core of what's happening and supporting the child into being successful. So a lot of times when adults say, I'm really into trauma, I'm really captivated by this, I always say, it actually is harder on us as the adult. It really is, because we don't just dismiss kids or situations as if it's a bad kid or we don't have time for that because we have to get our test scores up. That's not how we operate. And I think some people get in with the intention that it's rainbows and unicorns and gumdrops.
It's not.
And it's far from that. When you have, but it's worth every single, and it's what is right by our students. It's what right by our families. And it's what our systems need to finally get to. So, and you mentioned like, hey, we need more people to connect to. Well, the good news is there is a conference coming up, and you will be there, I hope.
Yes.
I don't know if I've sent you that yet, but if I haven't, I will. On July 19th to the 21st, which is the Trauma Informed Educators Network Conference, Enacting Equity. We have right now about 200 people registered. We have 48 presenters. We have 2 amazing keynotes. We have 1 expert panel. What I say is it's an opportunity for the disruptors to unite, because together we're coming together.
Yes.
And we're wanting to learn more from each other, because we are the experts, believe it or not, you all. Coming together and sharing our experiences and sharing our stories and sharing our successes and our failures is how we all move forward, right? And a cool part of this conference is that after every 2 sessions, we will join a small group of people together for all 3 days. So you will be with the same group of people virtually after every 2 sessions to talk, connect, debrief. We have some protocols that we're going to use. We did it in person and it was remarkable. People left connected, and that's exactly what we want. So if you haven't registered, please register very, very soon. We have 2 amazing partners. We have Stop It Solutions, which is a self-reporting support app that schools can use. And we also have Empower You, which is an amazing resource for SEL, looking at those core competencies. But even more importantly, they have a whole platform around teacher self-care and being able to go through, how do you manage your own stress? How do you manage your own processes of the amount of stress that being an educator and a parent and a caregiver and all of those other roles that we fill in and outside of school, how do you manage that in yourself in order to be the best for your kids? So 2 amazing partners, and it's going to be awesome. So please, if you haven't registered, it's $125 for all 3 days. And I want to say this: if you listen to this and that's a barrier, you can just email me you can even message me on social media or email me at Matthew@ParadigmShiftEducation, and I will break down that barrier for you. So please keep listening. And next week we have the amazing Dr. Warren Larkin from the UK, who is working on a global initiative with a previous guest, Becky Haas, on trauma-informed work. And ironically, I know Becky and I met Warren when I was speaking in England. So Tennessee and the UK come together in multiple ways that are so amazing, how all of this work happens. But nonetheless, please be safe. And as always, if you need to, wear a mask, but also wash your hands. Give me just a second. I gotta stop we're still live, but I'm gonna stop the recording so that, there we go. Thank you so much. For people who are listening, for those of you who are listening, Brandy, thank you for listening. You're local here, and I know you very well, and I know you believe in this work. So thank you for listening. Everyone else that was listening, thank you. And if you're listening when this is recorded, please come back and continue to listen. So thank you all, and you all have a great night. Just one second, Lachanda.
Yes, thank you.